Every year, thousands of people climb a mountain in the middle of the night. They wake up at 2 in the morning in a monastery that has stood in the Egyptian desert for nearly 1,500 years. They strap on headlamps. They follow a rocky path carved by centuries of pilgrims' feet. And somewhere around 4:30 in the morning, they reach the summit of Jebel Musa, a granite peak in the southern Sinai Peninsula, just in time to watch the sunrise burn across the desert floor. And they weep. They weep because they believe they are standing on the most sacred ground in human history, the place where the creator of the universe descended in fire and smoke, the place where Moses received the 10 Commandments, the place where an entire nation heard the voice of God and trembled. There is just one problem. They might be standing on the wrong mountain, and the evidence has been hiding in plain sight for 2,000 years, written in a language most of them have never read, in a letter most of them have skimmed past on Sunday mornings, without realizing what it actually says. This is the story of how an entire civilization may have been looking for the most important mountain in human history in the wrong country. And if the real mountain has been found, it changes everything we thought we knew about the Exodus, the route the Israelites traveled, and where the foundation of Western law and morality was actually delivered. But before we go looking for the right mountain, we need to understand how we ended up at the wrong one, because that story, honestly, is just as fascinating. Let us go back to the 4th century. The Roman Empire has just undergone the most dramatic religious transformation in human history. Emperor Constantine has legalized Christianity. His mother, a woman named Helena, has become perhaps the most enthusiastic pilgrim the world has ever seen. She is traveling across the Middle East, and she is on a mission to find every sacred site mentioned in the Bible and build something on top of it. Helena finds what she believes is the true cross in Jerusalem. She identifies the site of the Nativity in Bethlehem, and then her attention turns south, to the desert, to the question that had lingered for centuries. Where is Mount Sinai? Here is the thing you need to understand. Before Helena's era, nobody had identified a specific mountain as Sinai with any certainty. The location had essentially been lost. The Israelites had camped there for about a year, according to the book of Exodus, and then they moved on. They did not build a permanent temple there. They did not leave a sign that said, God was here. The mountain faded from living memory. So how did Helena's people choose the mountain in the southern Sinai Peninsula? The honest answer is that we do not entirely know. What we do know is that by the early 4th century, small communities of Christian monks had begun settling in the deserts of the Sinai Peninsula. They were drawn to the wilderness for the same reasons monks have always been drawn to wildernesses: silence, solitude, the feeling that God was closer when the noise of the world was far away. These monks had identified various peaks in the region as potentially sacred, and the tradition gradually coalesced around Jebel Musa. In the 6th century, Byzantine Emperor Justinian I built St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of this mountain. It is one of the oldest continually operating monasteries in the world. It houses some of the most important ancient manuscripts ever discovered, including the Codex Sinaiticus, one of the oldest complete copies of the New Testament. The monastery is a treasure in its own right, but step back and consider the timeline. The identification of this mountain as Sinai happened roughly 1,700 years after the events of the Exodus are traditionally dated. That is a gap of 17 centuries between the event and the identification. Imagine someone in the year 3700 pointing at a hill in rural England and saying, "This is where the Declaration of Independence was signed," and you start to get the scale of the problem and the archaeological evidence. It is not encouraging. Researchers have spent decades searching the Sinai Peninsula for any material evidence of the Israelites' presence: pottery shards, campfire remains, anything that would indicate a large group of people passed through the area during the relevant time period. The results have been consistent and frustrating. No Exodus-related archaeological remains dating to the traditional period have been recovered anywhere in the Sinai Peninsula. Some scholars argue this is exactly what you would expect. The Israelites were nomadic people living in tents. They used perishable materials. They did not build permanent structures during their wilderness wanderings. A group traveling through a desert 3,000 years ago would not necessarily leave a trace we could find today. That is a fair point, but it also means we are relying entirely on tradition, not evidence, when we point to this particular mountain. There is another problem with the traditional site that almost nobody talks about. The book of Deuteronomy, chapter 1, verse 2, contains a geographical clue that is astonishingly specific. It says, "It is 11 days from Horeb by way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea, 11 days of travel." That is not a poetic flourish. That is a distance measurement. Kadesh Barnea has been identified by archaeologists in the northeastern Sinai, near the border of modern Israel and Egypt. Mount Seir is associated with the territory of Edom in modern southern Jordan. If you calculate 11 days of travel on foot from Kadesh Barnea back through Mount Seir, you end up in the mountains of northwest Arabia, not in the southern Sinai Peninsula. The traditional Jebel Musa is far too close to Kadesh Barnea. You could walk from the traditional site to Kadesh in significantly less than 11 days. And then there is the Elijah test. In 1 Kings chapter 19, the prophet Elijah flees from Queen Jezebel. He starts at Beersheba in the south of Israel and travels 40 days and 40 nights to reach Horeb, the mountain of God. 40 days of walking from Beersheba. If Mount Sinai is at the traditional location in the southern Sinai Peninsula, the journey from Beersheba would take roughly 7 to 10 days on foot. A fit traveler could do it in a week. 40 days makes no sense for that distance unless Elijah was walking in circles. But if Horeb is in northwest Saudi Arabia, the distance from Beersheba through the Negev, down to the Gulf of Aqaba, across into Midian, and then to the Jabal al-Lawz range, is roughly the kind of journey that would require 40 days of wilderness travel. The numbers actually work. 2 independent distance calculations in the Bible. Both point away from the traditional site and toward Arabia, and yet, for 1700 years, we have ignored them. So, if the traditional site was chosen based on monk settlements and imperial patronage rather than historical evidence, the question becomes obvious. Did the ancient texts themselves ever tell us where to look? The answer is yes. And what they say might surprise you. We need to talk about a man named Paul. Before he became the most influential missionary in Christian history, Paul was a Pharisee. He was trained in Jerusalem under Gamaliel, one of the leading rabbinical scholars of the first century. He knew the Torah. He knew the Hebrew scriptures inside and out. He knew the geography of the ancient world. And around 49 AD, he wrote a letter to a group of believers in the region of Galatia, in modern Turkey. In that letter, in the 4th chapter, verse 25, Paul writes something that has been sitting in the New Testament for 2,000 years, waiting for people to actually pay attention to it. He writes, "For this, Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia." Arabia, not Egypt, not the Sinai Peninsula, Arabia. Some defenders of the traditional site will argue that the Sinai Peninsula was considered part of Arabia in Paul's day. And there is some truth to this. The Roman province called Arabia Petraea did include parts of the Sinai Peninsula, along with modern Jordan, southern Syria, and northwest Saudi Arabia. So the word Arabia in the 1st century was broader than our modern usage. But there is a problem with this defense. When Paul uses the word Arabia, he is not just throwing out a vague geographic term. He is making a theological argument. He is connecting Hagar, Abraham's slave wife, to the covenant of the law given at Sinai. And he is placing that mountain specifically in Arabia, using the term in a way his readers would have understood. So, what would a 1st century Jewish reader have understood Arabia to mean? The historian Josephus, writing around the same time as Paul, consistently uses Arabia to refer to the territory east of the Jordan River and the Gulf of Aqaba. He specifically describes Sinai as being between Egypt and Arabia, suggesting it was on the Arabian side of that boundary. When Josephus talks about the Nabatean kingdom, when he talks about the Midianites, when he talks about the territory of Ishmael's descendants, he points east, across the Gulf, into what we now call Saudi Arabia. And Josephus is not alone. Philo of Alexandria, writing in the 1st century. Origen in the 3rd century. Eusebius in the 4th century, Jerome also in the 4th century. These early church scholars, writing before and during the period when the traditional site was being established, all seem to place Sinai in Arabia proper, not in the Egyptian peninsula. Even the Quran, written in the 7th century, refers to Moses receiving the law at Tur Sinai and places the burning bush event in Midian. And Midian has always, in every ancient source we possess, been located in what is now northwest Saudi Arabia. So here is the situation. We have the Apostle Paul, trained as a Pharisee, explicitly saying Sinai is in Arabia. We have Josephus, the most important Jewish historian of the 1st century, suggesting the same. We have multiple early church fathers pointing in the same direction. And then, several centuries later, a tradition develops around a mountain in Egypt, a tradition that sticks because an empress built a church there and an emperor built a monastery. What if they were all right? The early writers, not the later tradition. What if the real Mount Sinai has been sitting in Saudi Arabia this entire time? That question is not rhetorical, because in the last few decades, people have gone looking, and what they found at the base of a mountain called Jabal al-Lawz, next to a blackened peak called Jabal Makla, is either the most significant biblical discovery of the modern era or one of the most elaborate cases of wishful thinking in archaeological history. The evidence goes both ways, and we are going to look at all of it. But first, we need to do something that almost nobody in this debate does properly. We need to open the original Hebrew text and let Moses tell us where he actually was. If you want to understand where Mount Sinai really is, you cannot start with a map. You have to start with a word. In the 3rd chapter of Exodus, verse 1, the Hebrew text says something that most English translations flatten into nothing. Moses is tending the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, who is called the priest of Midian. And the text says, Moses led the flock Achar Hamidbar, which means beyond the wilderness, or to the far side of the wilderness. The word midbar in Hebrew does not mean what you probably picture when you read wilderness in English. When you hear wilderness, you imagine thick forests, maybe bears, maybe a survival show. But the Hebrew midbar is something completely different. It comes from the root davar, which means to speak or to drive. A midbar is an open, arid place where flocks are driven to graze. It is the land beyond the settled areas, the pasture land at the edge of civilization. Pay attention to this next detail because it changes the geography of the entire debate. The text says Moses went beyond or behind the midbar. The Hebrew word achar means behind, after, or to the far side of. Moses did not just walk into the wilderness. He went through it and came out the other side. He went to the far edge of the grazing lands of Midian. And where did he end up? At the mountain of God, Horeb. This is crucial. Moses was in Midian. He was tending the flocks of a Midianite priest. He walked to the far side of the Midianite wilderness, and he arrived at the mountain of God. So, where was Midian? This is one of the rare cases in biblical geography where there is virtually no scholarly disagreement. Midian was in the northwest corner of the Arabian Peninsula, in what is now Saudi Arabia. The ancient city of Midian has been identified with the modern town of Al-Bad in the Tabuk region of Saudi Arabia. Archaeological excavations have confirmed this identification. The Midianites were an Arabian people. Think about what this means for the traditional site. If Moses was in Midian, tending Midianite flocks, and he walked to the far side of the Midianite wilderness and found the mountain of God, that mountain should logically be in or near Midian, in Arabia, not hundreds of miles away on the Egyptian side of the Sinai Peninsula. Defenders of the traditional site will argue that Moses could have traveled a great distance with his flocks. Shepherds do cover large areas, but the text does not describe an epic journey. It describes a shepherd going to the far edge of his pasture land, which is a normal thing shepherds do. The burning bush is presented as something that happened during an ordinary day of work, not at the end of an expedition. Let us keep reading. After the burning bush encounter, God tells Moses to bring the Israelites back to this same mountain. In Exodus chapter 3, verse 12, God says, "When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." The Hebrew is clear. Har Hazeh, this mountain, the one Moses is standing on, the one in or near Midian. This is where the Exodus route becomes critical. The standard assumption is that the Israelites left Egypt, crossed the Red Sea somewhere near the modern Suez Canal, and then wandered through the Sinai Peninsula. That is the route you see on the maps in the back of every study Bible. But those maps were drawn to match the traditional site. They are not derived from the text itself. Let us look at what the text actually describes. The Hebrew word for the body of water the Israelites crossed is Yam Suf. For generations, this was translated as Red Sea. But Suf in Hebrew means reeds. It literally translates to Sea of Reeds. Some scholars have argued that this refers to a marshy lake near the Mediterranean coast or somewhere along the modern Suez Canal. But 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 26 uses the same term, Yam Suf, to describe the body of water near Etzion Geber, which is at the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba. That is the narrow body of water that separates the Sinai Peninsula from Saudi Arabia. If the Yam Suf crossing happened at the Gulf of Aqaba rather than at the Suez Canal area, the entire Exodus route shifts dramatically. Instead of wandering around the Sinai Peninsula, the Israelites would have traveled down the western coast of the peninsula, crossed the Gulf of Aqaba, and arrived in Midian, in Arabia, where Paul said Sinai was, where Moses was already familiar with the territory, where the mountain of God was waiting. One proposed crossing point is a beach on the Sinai coast called Nuweiba. Several researchers have noted that an underwater land bridge extends from Nuweiba across the Gulf of Aqaba toward the Saudi coast. The water on either side of this ridge drops to significant depth, but the ridge itself is relatively shallow. Whether this natural formation played any role in the Exodus account remains speculative. But the geography is suggestive. A crossing at Nuweiba would deposit the Israelites directly in the Midian region, within reach of Jabal al-Lawz. There is another Hebrew detail that gets overlooked. When the Israelites arrive at Sinai, the text describes the mountain in very specific terms. Exodus chapter 19 verse 18 says that Mount Sinai was altogether in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire. The Hebrew uses the phrase kulo ashan, meaning all of its smoke, and compares it to the smoke of a kiln, a kivshan. The entire mountain smoked like an industrial furnace. Some scholars have suggested this description sounds volcanic, and that is an interesting observation. Because there are no volcanoes in the Sinai Peninsula, there have not been any active volcanic features there in recorded geological history. But northwest Saudi Arabia, that region sits on the edge of a major volcanic field. The Harat Rahat lava fields extend through western Arabia. The geology of the Jabal al-Lawz region includes volcanic rock, basalt formations, and evidence of ancient thermal activity. Does this prove the mountain was a volcano? No. The text attributes the fire and smoke to the presence of God, not to geological processes. But it is worth noting that the description fits the geology of Arabia far better than it fits the geology of the Sinai Peninsula. There is one more Hebrew word we need to examine, and this one might be the most telling of all. The mountain has two names in the Hebrew Bible. It is called Sinai, and it is called Horeb. Scholars have debated for centuries whether these are two names for the same place or two different locations within the same mountain range. The Protestant reformer John Calvin believed they were the same mountain, with Sinai referring to the eastern face and Horeb to the western face. But look at the meaning of the names themselves. Scholars believe Sinai may derive from Sin, the Mesopotamian moon deity, suggesting the mountain was associated with moon worship before the Israelites arrived. And Horeb. The Hebrew word Chorev means dry place or desolation, but it also carries the sense of glowing heat. Some etymologists connect it to the idea of scorching or burning. A mountain associated with the moon on one side and burning heat on the other. A mountain that smoked like a furnace. A mountain in the land of Midian, beyond the wilderness in Arabia. If you are the kind of person who reads the original languages, you are probably sitting up a little straighter right now, because everything in the Hebrew text points away from the Sinai Peninsula and toward Arabia. The geographical references, the descriptions, the names, the distance calculations. So the obvious question is, has anyone actually gone to Arabia and looked? The answer is yes. And what they found there has ignited a firestorm of controversy that the academic world is still trying to process. But before I take you to that mountain, I want you to think about something for a moment. Have you ever been absolutely certain you knew where something was? Maybe it was your car keys, maybe it was a relationship, maybe it was your purpose in life. You were so sure you knew where to find it that you never bothered looking anywhere else. And then one day you realized you had been searching in the wrong room the entire time. The thing you were looking for was never where everyone told you it would be. That is what this story is about. Not just for archaeologists, for all of us. Because if we can get the location of the single most important divine encounter in the Hebrew Bible wrong for 17 centuries, what else might we be wrong about? What other assumptions have we inherited without questioning? What other truths are sitting in the original text waiting for someone to actually read them? That is the real mystery here, not just where the mountain is, but why we stopped looking. In 1984, a man named Ron Wyatt claimed he had found the real Mount Sinai. We need to be honest about Ron Wyatt. He was an amateur archaeologist from Tennessee who also claimed to have found Noah's Ark, the Ark of the Covenant chariot wheels at the bottom of the Red Sea, and several other biblical artifacts. His track record was, to put it charitably, controversial. Many of his claims have been thoroughly debunked. The professional archaeological community largely regards his work with skepticism. But there is a principle of logic that matters here. It is called the genetic fallacy. It means that discounting a conclusion solely because of who made it is a logical error. A broken clock is right twice a day. And just because Ron Wyatt had a problematic reputation does not automatically mean he was wrong about everything. Wyatt pointed to a mountain range in northwest Saudi Arabia, near the ancient city of Midian, in the Tabuk region. The range is called Jabal al-Lawz, which means Mountain of Almonds. Next to it sits a slightly shorter peak called Jabal Makla, which in Arabic means something that should get your attention: the Burnt Mountain. Wyatt was not alone in looking here. In 1988, two Americans named Bob Cornuke and Larry Williams made a now famous expedition to the site. They entered Saudi Arabia, traveled to the mountain range, and documented what they saw before being detained by Saudi authorities. What they brought back was a set of photographs and descriptions that, whether you believe them or not, are genuinely remarkable. Let us walk through what has been found at this site. And I want to be clear about something. I am going to present the evidence, and I am going to present the counter-arguments. Because this is a detective case, not a sermon. You deserve to see both sides. The blackened peak. The summit of Jabal Makla is black, not dark brown, not shadowed, black. When you look at the mountain from the surrounding plain, the top portion appears scorched, as if intense heat had been applied to the rock surface. The surrounding mountains in the same range do not share this feature. They are the normal tan and brown color you would expect in the Arabian desert. When early visitors broke open some of these darkened rocks, they reported that only the outer surface was blackened. The interior was a different color. This suggested to them that something had happened to the exterior of the rock that did not affect its interior, like extreme heat applied from outside. Exodus chapter 19 describes God descending on Sinai in fire, with smoke rising like a furnace and the whole mountain trembling. If you take that description at face value and then look at a mountain with an inexplicably blackened peak in the exact region where the Bible places the events, the connection is hard to ignore. But the counter-argument is significant. Geologist Dr. John Morris examined rock samples from Jabal Makla and concluded that the dark coloring is natural metamorphic rock, typical for the volcanic region. The area sits on Precambrian geological formations that include contact metamorphic rocks, which are naturally dark. Geologist Dr. Glenn Fritz, who actually supports the Jabal al-Lawz theory for other reasons, agrees that the blackened rock is natural basalt, not the result of divine fire. He points out that the basic chemical composition of granite does not transform into dark rock through surface heating. It might melt, flow, and recrystallize at extreme temperatures, but it would not become the type of dark rock found on Jabal Makla. So the blackened peak is suggestive. It is visually striking. It fits the narrative, but the geology is ambiguous at best. The split rock. Several kilometers to the northwest of the main mountain, on what would have been the approach route from the Red Sea coast, sits one of the most photographed objects in the entire Mount Sinai debate. A massive rock, approximately 60 feet tall, split cleanly down the middle. The rock stands on an elevated hill. At its base, the ground shows clear signs of water erosion, with smooth channels and worn rock surfaces. This is in a region that receives roughly half an inch of rainfall per year. The erosion is present on this rock and the area immediately surrounding it, but not on other rocks nearby. Exodus chapter 17 tells the story of the Israelites running out of water at a place called Rephidim. God instructs Moses to strike a rock at Horeb, and water pours out to supply the entire camp. The text says Moses named the place Massah and Meribah, which means testing and quarreling, because the people had quarreled and tested the Lord. If you are looking for a rock that was split open with water flowing from it in the vicinity of the mountain of God, this rock fits the description almost too perfectly. But again, the counter-arguments deserve a hearing. Split rocks are not unique to this location. Northwest Saudi Arabia has multiple examples of large stones split vertically, a phenomenon caused by frost wedging. Desert temperatures swing dramatically between day and night. Water seeps into cracks during rare rainfall, freezes during cold desert nights, expands, and over thousands of years splits the rock cleanly. The smoothed surfaces at the base could be the result of occasional flash flooding rather than a miraculous water flow. Dr. Glenn Fritz, despite supporting the Jabal al-Lawz theory overall, has specifically dismissed this particular rock as having any connection to the biblical narrative. He considers it a natural geological formation. So the split rock is compelling. It is in the right area. It shows water erosion in an arid zone, but it may be a coincidence of nature, the plain and the campsite. Before we get to the golden calf altar, there is a feature of this site that deserves attention because it addresses one of the biggest logistical questions in the entire Exodus debate. The Book of Numbers records census figures suggesting the Israelite camp may have included 600,000 fighting men, plus women, children, and a mixed multitude of non-Israelites who joined them. Conservative estimates put the total population somewhere between 1 and 2 million people. More critical scholars argue the numbers are symbolic or exaggerated, but whatever the actual number, the camp was large, very large. Any proposed Mount Sinai needs a plain at its base big enough to support that kind of population, even temporarily. Tents, livestock, water sources, grazing land for animals. The traditional site at Jebel Musa has a relatively small plain in front of it called Erahah. It measures roughly 2 miles long by about half a mile wide. Some researchers have argued this is simply not large enough for the camp described in Exodus. Jabal Makla has a wide eastern plain stretching out from the base of the mountain that is significantly larger. Multiple researchers who have visited the site have described it as easily capable of accommodating a massive encampment. The plain extends for miles and is bordered by low hills that would have provided natural boundaries for the camp, which is consistent with the biblical description of the Israelites camping before the mountain. There is also a dry stream bed that runs from one of the peaks down to the base of the mountain, right next to the altar site. Deuteronomy chapter 9 verse 21 describes Moses grinding the golden calf to powder as fine as dust and throwing it into the brook that descended out of the mount, a seasonal stream flowing from the mountain to the camp. At Jabal Makla, that stream exists, and roughly a mile north of the camp area, outside what would have been the boundaries of the Israelite encampment, researchers have documented an ancient pre-Islamic graveyard. Exodus chapter 32 records that after the golden calf incident, Moses ordered the Levites to punish those who had participated in the idolatry. The text says about 3,000 men died that day. A burial ground outside the camp perimeter, in the right location, and of uncertain but ancient date, fits this account. Again, none of this is conclusive on its own. Desert graveyards can come from any period. Dry stream beds are common. Large plains exist across the Arabian landscape, but the convergence of all these features at the same site, in the same spatial arrangement described in the text, adds another layer to an already compelling pattern: the golden calf altar. This is where things get really interesting. Approximately 1.8 miles from the base of Jabal Makla, there is a pile of large rocks, roughly 30 feet by 30 feet by 20 feet high, with a flat top. On and around these rocks, researchers have found petroglyphs, rock carvings, specifically carvings of bulls and cows, and carvings of human figures who appear to be engaged in worship around these cattle. Finding pictures of cattle in Saudi Arabia is unusual. Cattle are not indigenous to the Arabian desert. Camels, yes. Goats, yes. But cattle? In the desert of northwest Arabia, the petroglyphs depict animals that some researchers believe resemble the Egyptian bull god Apis and the cow goddess Hathor. According to Exodus chapter 32, while Moses was on the mountain receiving the commandments, the Israelites grew impatient. They asked Aaron, Moses' brother, to make them gods. Aaron collected their gold jewelry, melted it down, and fashioned a golden calf. The people built an altar in front of it and began to worship. The text specifically says they sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play, a Hebrew phrase that implies something far more intense than a picnic. Some translations render this as revelry, and the Hebrew strongly suggests sexual activity. The text also says the people were perua, which means unrestrained or naked. At the Jabal Makla site, the rock carvings appear to show naked figures engaged in celebratory or worship activities around bull images. A pile of rocks with a flat top sits at the center, precisely the sort of structure you would expect from an improvised altar. The Saudi government has erected security fences around this site. A sign in both Arabic and English confirms it is an area of archaeological significance. Saudi police patrol the area. According to the published Saudi Archaeological Survey, there is a local tradition that this is where the golden calf episode took place and that gold is buried underneath the stones. The Saudi government's official position, published in their archaeological reports, is that the petroglyphs are part of a general cultural tradition of cattle representation spanning from the Neolithic to the Nabatean period. They deny any correlation between these images and the Exodus narrative. Dr. Charles Whitaker challenged this conclusion in his 2003 doctoral dissertation. When you compare the bull images at this site to depictions of Apis and Hathor from Egyptian art, there are clear stylistic similarities. He was cautious about drawing definitive conclusions. He pointed out that bovine imagery appears at other sites across the Arabian Peninsula, but he also noted that the Saudi government's published conclusion seems designed to distance the site from any mosaic connection. And that raises another question. Why would the Saudi government fence off these particular rocks and patrol them with police? Why the official denial? What exactly are they protecting? We may never get a definitive answer to that question, but the fact that it hangs in the air is itself part of the story. The 12 pillars and the altar. At the base of Jabal Makla's eastern face, researchers have documented what they describe as the remains of a stone structure consistent with an altar, flanked by the remnants of stone pillars. Exodus chapter 24 describes Moses building an altar at the foot of the mountain and setting up 12 stone pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Animal sacrifices were performed at this altar as part of the covenant ceremony. The structure at Jabal Makla includes what researchers describe as two parallel rows of uncut stones forming a channel shape, consistent with an animal chute used for sacrificial purposes. Behind this formation, partially buried in the ground, are stone pillars. Critics point out that the pottery found at this site has been identified by Saudi archaeologists as Nabatean, dating to a period considerably later than the Exodus. The Nabateans were an Arabian people who thrived from roughly the 4th century BC to the 2nd century AD. If the pottery is Nabatean, the altar structure may have nothing to do with Moses. However, proponents argue that a sacred site could have been reused over centuries. The fact that later peoples used the same spot for religious purposes does not preclude earlier use. And they note that Nabatean pottery at a site does not mean the site's origins are Nabatean. It only means the Nabateans were there at some point. Elijah's cave. 1 Kings chapter 19 tells the story of the prophet Elijah centuries after Moses fleeing from Queen Jezebel. The text says Elijah traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. God spoke to him, not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in a still small voice. The Hebrew phrase is kol damama daka, which could be translated as a sound of thin silence or a voice of gentle stillness. On the lower eastern slopes of Jabal Makla, there is a cave. It is approximately 20 feet deep and 15 feet high. It is exactly the sort of shelter a single person fleeing through the wilderness would seek out. Its location on the mountain matches the biblical description of being part way up the mountainside. Is this the specific cave where Elijah heard the voice of God? There is absolutely no way to prove that. Any mountain in the Middle East could have a cave of similar dimensions, but the convergence of features is notable. The cave is on a mountain in the right region, on a peak that matches multiple other biblical descriptions, at a site where other archaeological features align with the Exodus narrative. No single piece of evidence here is conclusive. The blackened peak might be natural geology, the split rock might be frost wedging, the petroglyphs might be general Arabian cattle imagery, the pillars might be Nabatean, the cave might be just a cave. But consider this. What are the odds that all of these features, every single one described in the biblical text, would converge on the same mountain, in the exact region where the Bible places the events, in the land of Midian, in Arabia, when no comparable convergence of evidence exists at the traditional site in Egypt? Each individual piece might have an alternative explanation, but the pattern? The pattern is harder to dismiss. We have been building a case, and if you are the kind of person who values intellectual honesty, you should be feeling a certain tension right now, because the evidence for Jabal Makla is genuinely compelling. But the counter-arguments are also real, and a responsible investigation examines both sides without flinching. So let us take the strongest objections seriously. The first and most significant objection comes from archaeology itself. The professional archaeological establishment has been largely skeptical of the Jabal al-Lawz theory, and their reasons are not trivial. The Armstrong Institute published a detailed two-part analysis in 2024 defending the traditional site. Their central argument is this: the people who popularized the Saudi Arabia theory, from Ron Wyatt to Bob Cornuke to Larry Williams, were not trained archaeologists. They were adventurers, treasure hunters, and in some cases, individuals with documented credibility problems. Not a single claim made by these explorers has been verified through peer-reviewed archaeological methodology. No controlled excavations have been conducted at the site. no stratigraphic analysis, no systematic pottery dating beyond the Saudi government's Nabatean identification. That is a legitimate criticism. In archaeology, how you dig matters as much as what you find. An artifact without context, without proper documentation of where exactly it was found and in what layer of soil, tells you almost nothing. And the evidence from Jabal Makla has come primarily from surface observations, photographs taken during unauthorized visits, and reports from people who were often more interested in proving a point than conducting careful science. The second objection concerns the word Arabia in Paul's letter. Gordon Franz, a biblical archaeologist who has written extensively on this topic, makes a detailed case that Paul's use of Arabia in Galatians 4:25 would have been understood broadly by his first-century readers. Franz points to Josephus's writings, which describe Arabia as encompassing territory from southern Syria to the Sinai Peninsula. The Roman province of Arabia Petraea included the Sinai. So when Paul says Sinai is in Arabia, he may not be pointing to Saudi Arabia specifically. He may simply be saying it is in the broader region that Romans called Arabia, which could include the Sinai Peninsula. Franz also makes a chronological point about the word itself. The term Arab and Arabia do not appear in the book of Exodus at all. These words entered the historical record much later, first appearing in Assyrian inscriptions around 853 BC. So Paul is using a term from his own time, not from Moses' time, and we should interpret it according to first-century geography, not modern maps. This is a fair argument, but it has a weakness. Even if Arabia could technically include the Sinai Peninsula under Roman provincial boundaries, the core of what first-century people meant by Arabia was the land east of the Jordan and the Gulf of Aqaba. The Sinai Peninsula was the edge case, the borderline territory. When Paul says Sinai is in Arabia, the most natural reading for his audience would point east, not west. Especially since he is connecting Sinai to Hagar, whose descendants, the Ishmaelites, were associated with the Arabian interior, not the Egyptian frontier. There is also a third candidate for Mount Sinai that deserves mention because intellectual honesty requires it. An Italian archaeologist named Emanuele Anati spent over 30 years excavating a ridge in the Negev desert of southern Israel called Har Karkom. At Har Karkom, Anati discovered over 1,300 archaeological sites, 40,000 rock engravings, and more than 120 rock cult sites. He became convinced that Har Karkom was the biblical Mount Sinai. At a 2013 colloquium in Israel, an international group of scholars debated Anati's claims alongside the Saudi Arabia theory. The scholars who attended did not even discuss the traditional Jebel Musa site. They considered it essentially ruled out. The real debate was between Har Karkom and the Arabian candidates. Anati's problem is chronological. The most significant archaeological remains at Har Karkom date to the 3rd millennium BC, roughly 1,000 years before the traditional date of the Exodus. If the Exodus occurred around 1450 BC or even 1250 BC, the peak of sacred activity at Har Karkom was long over by then. So the Negev candidate has impressive archaeology, but the wrong dates. The Saudi Arabia candidate has the right geography and the right textual support, but insufficient professional excavation. And the traditional site has the right tradition, but neither the archaeology nor the textual support. The third objection against Jabal Makla is geological. We discussed the blackened peak. Multiple geologists have confirmed that the dark rock on Jabal Makla is natural metamorphic basalt, part of a Precambrian volcanic field. The entire mountain range includes volcanic rock. The dark coloring is not unique to the peak of Makla. It extends across significant portions of the regional geology. This is perhaps the most damaging piece of counter-evidence. If the blackened summit is simply natural basalt rather than the result of divine fire, then one of the most visually striking features of the site loses its evidentiary value. The mountain looks burnt, but looking burnt and being burnt are different things. The fourth objection concerns the petroglyphs. Bull and cattle imagery appears at archaeological sites across the entire Arabian Peninsula. From the Neolithic period through the Nabatean era, people in this region carved images of animals on rocks. Finding bull petroglyphs near a mountain in Saudi Arabia is not unusual. It is expected. The presence of bovine imagery does not automatically connect a site to the Exodus narrative. Furthermore, Rabbi Alexander Houle, author of Searching for Sinai, The Location of Revelation, raises an interesting theological objection. He argues that if the golden calf worship site had been real, the evidence would have been destroyed. Exodus chapter 34, verse 13, commands the Israelites to destroy altars and sacred stones associated with pagan worship. Moses himself ground the golden calf to powder, mixed it with water, and made the Israelites drink it. If Moses followed through on destroying the evidence of idolatry, why would we expect to find intact petroglyphs and altar structures thousands of years later? That is a genuinely clever argument. It turns the absence of evidence at the traditional site into a point in its favor. Maybe there is nothing to find at the real Sinai because the evidence was intentionally destroyed. But there is a counter to this counter. The command in Exodus 34 is about Canaanite altars in the Promised Land, not about the Sinai camp. And while Moses destroyed the golden calf itself, the text does not say he destroyed the rock on which the altar stood or the surrounding petroglyphs. Rock carvings are not so easily eliminated. You can destroy an idol without erasing every carving on every stone in the vicinity. So where does all of this leave us? Somewhere uncomfortable. And I think that discomfort is important. The traditional site has tradition on its side. 1,500 years of monastic devotion. One of the world's great manuscripts discovered in its monastery. The weight of centuries of pilgrimage. But it has no archaeological support, a shaky textual foundation, and it requires the Israelites to have somehow ended up in a place that does not match the geography of their own story. The Saudi Arabia site has geographical alignment, textual support, a convergence of physical features, and the weight of Paul's own words. But it has no controlled excavation, natural geological explanations for its most dramatic features, and it relies heavily on the reports of untrained explorers whose methods would not pass academic muster. If you were on a jury, you would not have enough evidence to convict beyond reasonable doubt, but you would have more than enough for probable cause. And maybe that is the honest place to stand right now. Not certainty, not dismissal, but serious, warranted curiosity. Because here is what I keep coming back to. The text itself, the original Hebrew, Exodus, and the letter to the Galatians, and the writings of Josephus, all point in the same direction. The text says Midian. The text says Arabia. The text says beyond the wilderness. The text says 11 days from Kadesh Barnea, and every one of those markers points east across the Gulf of Aqaba to the mountains of northwest Saudi Arabia. The tradition says otherwise, and we have to ask ourselves, when the text and the tradition disagree, which one do we follow? That is not just an archaeological question, that is a life question, and we need to sit with it for a moment. Because think about your own life right now. How many of the things you believe about yourself, about God, about how the world works, did you actually derive from the original source? And how many did you inherit from a tradition that someone started centuries ago for reasons that may have had nothing to do with truth? We all have our traditional Mount Sinais, the places where we have built monasteries of certainty, the mountains we climb in the dark, absolutely convinced we are going to the right summit. And sometimes, maybe more often than we want to admit, we are climbing the wrong mountain because someone we trusted pointed us there, and we never thought to check the map ourselves. The Hebrew Bible has a word for this, ta'ah. It means to wander, to stray, to go astray, and it is exactly the word used to describe sheep that have lost their way. There is no shame in the wandering. The shame would be in refusing to look up and reorient once you realize the terrain does not match the description. We have traveled a long way together, from the candlelit chambers of St. Catherine's Monastery to the fenced-off rocks of northwest Saudi Arabia, from the Greek of Paul's letters to the Hebrew of Moses' account, from academic journals to desert caves. But I want to step back from the evidence for a moment and talk about something that documentaries about Mount Sinai almost never address. And it might be the most important part of this entire story. Why does it matter? Not just historically, not just archaeologically. Why does the location of this mountain matter to you right now, today? The answer is buried in a Hebrew word that we have not examined yet. The word is midbar. We talked about it earlier as wilderness, but we only scratched the surface, because midbar is one of the most theologically loaded words in the entire Hebrew Bible, and understanding it changes everything about why this mountain matters. In the biblical narrative, the midbar is not just a geographical location, it is a spiritual category. It is the place between Egypt and the Promised Land, between slavery and freedom, between who you were and who you are becoming. The Israelites did not go to the wilderness by accident. God led them there deliberately. The shortest route from Egypt to Canaan was along the Mediterranean coast, a journey of about 2 weeks. God specifically avoided that route. Exodus chapter 13 verse 17 says, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. Instead, God led them into the wilderness, into the midbar, the long way around. Why? Because the midbar is where transformation happens. It is where you strip away everything that is not essential. It is where you discover what you actually believe when the comforts of civilization are gone. It is where you find out if your faith is real or if it is just a habit you inherited from your culture. And it is in the midbar that God speaks. Look at the pattern. Abraham encountered God in the wilderness. Moses found the burning bush in the wilderness. Elijah heard the still small voice in the wilderness. John the Baptist preached in the wilderness. Jesus went into the wilderness for 40 days before beginning his ministry. The wilderness is not a detour. It is the destination, and Mount Sinai, wherever it is, stands at the center of the wilderness experience. It is the place where a nation of former slaves received a new identity, where they stopped being defined by where they came from and started being defined by where they were going, where the God who had been a rumor, a family legend, a story their grandparents told them in Egypt, became real, became present, became terrifyingly, beautifully, overwhelmingly close. The Hebrew word for the moment God descended on the mountain is yarad. It means to come down, to descend. The same word is used in Genesis for the flood. The same word is used for going down to Egypt. It implies movement from a higher place to a lower one, not just physically, but in terms of vulnerability. When God descends to Sinai, it is an act of divine condescension. the infinite making itself accessible to the finite, the Creator entering the created world in a way that shakes the ground. And the people's response? The text says they trembled. The Hebrew is sharad. It does not just mean shaking with fear. It means a deep, involuntary physical response to the presence of something overwhelming. It is the trembling you feel when something is so real, so undeniable, so beyond anything you have ever experienced that your body responds before your mind can catch up. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where something was so true, so raw, so unmistakably real that you felt it in your bones before you could put it into words. That is what happened at Sinai, whatever mountain it was. Consider what that experience actually produced. The Ten Commandments are not just a religious document. They are the foundation of every legal system in the Western world. The idea that there are universal moral laws that apply equally to kings and peasants, that murder is wrong regardless of who commits it, that bearing false witness corrupts justice, that coveting your neighbor's life leads to destruction. These ideas did not exist in the ancient world before Sinai. In Egypt, the Pharaoh was the law. In Mesopotamia, the gods were capricious and their commands were arbitrary. The concept of a moral law that binds everyone, including the deity who gives it, was revolutionary. It still is. And that revolution happened at a specific mountain, on a specific day, to a specific group of people who were terrified out of their minds. They did not receive these commandments in a library. They received them in a thunderstorm, with the ground shaking beneath their feet. With a voice so overwhelming they begged Moses to make it stop. That matters. The location matters. Because the physical reality of the event grounds it in history, not mythology. The thing about that experience is that it does not depend on getting the geography right. The people who climb Jebel Musa at 4 in the morning and weep at the sunrise. Their experience is real. Their encounter with the sacred is real, even if they are on the wrong mountain. Because the point of Sinai was never the mountain. The point was the encounter. The point was that God descended. The point was that a group of people who had been defined by their slavery heard a voice that said, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage." The voice did not say, "I am the God of this particular mountain." The voice said, "I brought you out." The emphasis is on the relationship, not the real estate. But the search for the right mountain still matters, and the reason goes deeper than archaeology. When we misidentify the location, we unconsciously give ourselves permission to treat the whole story as myth. If the traditional site has no archaeological support, skeptics can point to that absence and say, "See? The Exodus never happened. There is no evidence." And for decades, that is exactly what many secular scholars have done. The lack of evidence in the Sinai Peninsula has been used as an argument against the historicity of the Exodus itself. But what if the evidence exists? What if it has been sitting on the other side of the Gulf of Aqaba, in a country that restricts access, guarded by fences and police, unexcavated and unstudied, because the academic world has been looking in the wrong place? That would not prove that God descended in fire. Science cannot measure the divine, but it would prove that a massive group of people camped at the base of a mountain in Arabia, performed sacrifices, created altars, and left traces that match the biblical description with remarkable specificity. It would move the Exodus from no evidence to significant evidence. And that shift matters, Not because faith requires evidence, but because faith should not be undermined by evidence that was simply never found because nobody bothered to look in the right place. There is a concept in Hebrew called emunah. It is usually translated as faith, but that translation is misleading. The Hebrew word comes from the root aman, which means to be firm, to be steady, to be reliable. Emunah is not blind belief. It is not closing your eyes and hoping. It is the steadfast reliability that comes from having encountered something real. The Israelites at Sinai did not believe in God because someone told them to. They believed because the mountain shook, because the voice spoke, because the experience was so overwhelming that their bodies trembled. Real faith is not threatened by evidence. Real faith goes looking for it. And that is why the question of Mount Sinai's location matters, not because God needs a GPS coordinate, but because we need to know that the story happened somewhere, that it was not just a metaphor, that real people stood at the base of a real mountain and heard something that changed the course of human civilization. Whether that mountain is in Egypt or Saudi Arabia, the voice that spoke from it said something that still echoes through every legal system, every moral code, every human rights document on the planet. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall have no other gods before me. Those words came from somewhere, and the search for that somewhere is not just an academic exercise. It is a pilgrimage, an act of taking the text seriously enough to follow where it leads, even when it leads away from comfortable tradition. And maybe, just maybe, that is the real lesson of the Midbar. The wilderness is where you go when you are willing to leave behind what is familiar in order to find what is true. We started this journey with a question: where is Mount Sinai? And I want to be honest with you about where I think the evidence leads, while acknowledging what we do not and cannot know. The traditional site in the southern Sinai Peninsula was chosen based on monastic tradition, not on historical evidence. No Exodus-era archaeological remains have been found there. The geography does not align well with the biblical text. The distance calculations do not work. The site was identified roughly 1700 years after the events it claims to commemorate. The Saudi Arabia site at Jabal Makla and Jabal al-Lawz sits in the ancient land of Midian, where the Bible explicitly places Moses and the burning bush. It is in Arabia where Paul explicitly places Mount Sinai. It has a blackened peak, a split rock with water erosion, bull worship petroglyphs, a 12-pillar altar structure, a cave matching Elijah's description, a stream bed descending from the mountain, an ancient graveyard outside the camp area, and a plain large enough to accommodate a massive encampment. Every one of these features has an alternative natural explanation, but no other site in the Middle East has all of them converging in the same place. The honest conclusion? We do not have certainty. What we have is a very strong circumstantial case that has never been properly investigated because the Saudi government restricts access and the academic establishment has been slow to take it seriously. What needs to happen is straightforward. Controlled archaeological excavation at Jabal Makla, professional stratigraphic analysis of the altar site, peer-reviewed dating of the petroglyphs using modern techniques, independent geological survey of the blackened rock, open academic access to a site that has been treated as a political sensitivity rather than a historical treasure. Until that happens, we are left with a mystery, and mysteries in the biblical tradition are not problems to be solved. They are invitations to go deeper. Remember the word we discussed earlier? Midbar, the wilderness, the place where God speaks, the place of transformation. The search for Mount Sinai is itself a kind of midbar experience. You start with what you think you know. You lose your certainty in the desert of evidence and counter-evidence. You struggle with competing claims. And somewhere in that struggle, if you are paying attention, you hear something. Not the roar of a volcano, not the crack of thunder on a desert peak. Something quieter, something that the prophet Elijah, standing in that cave on the mountain of God, heard after the wind and the earthquake and the fire had passed. A still, small voice. The Hebrew, one more time. Kol demama daka. A sound of thin silence. A voice of gentle stillness. It is the voice that says, the mountain was never the point. The voice was the point. The encounter was the point. The commandments were the point. The relationship between the Creator and the created, offered not in a palace or a temple, but in the middle of nowhere, in the wilderness, at the edge of human civilization, to a group of former slaves who had nothing to offer except their willingness to listen. That is what Mount Sinai means, wherever it stands, and that is what this search has been about. Not proving a theory, not winning an argument, but taking the text seriously enough to follow where it leads, and trusting that the same voice that spoke from that mountain, whatever mountain it was, is still speaking today. To you, right now, in whatever wilderness you find yourself in. The tradition says the mountain is in Egypt. The text says it is in Arabia. The evidence is incomplete. The debate is ongoing. The excavation has not happened yet. But the voice? The voice has never stopped. If you are the kind of person who does not settle for second-hand answers, if you actually want to dig into the Hebrew and Greek texts behind these mysteries, if you want to see the evidence for yourself rather than taking anyone's word for it, this channel is where that happens every week. Subscribe, because the next video goes even deeper into a question that nobody has thought to ask. And if this video made you think, if it challenged an assumption or opened a door you did not know was there, share it with one person who would care. Not because I need the views, but because this conversation matters. It has been 1700 years overdue. The mountain is still out there, and the voice is still speaking. The only question is whether we are willing to go to the wilderness to hear it.